everyone. Welcome to the Field and Garden Podcast. I'm Jessie Graven from the Gardener's Workshop. Today I have more keeper clips from Clubhouse for you. Lisa hosts a chat called the Flower Farmer Show on the Clubhouse app each Wednesday to cover various flower farming and flower business topics, as well as answer listener questions. In today's episode, I'm sharing some great clips of Lisa covering the topics of succession planting and the 411 on zinnias. She offers some great tips here that can make a big difference for your farm or garden, so I hope you enjoy.
So welcome everybody to the Flower Farmer Show. My name is Lisa Mason Ziegler, and I'm really glad you've decided to join us here today. And today I want to talk about succession planting because I feel like it is one of the things that I personally struggled with. First off, I didn't even realize that was a big part of farming. And then I couldn't quite figure out how to do it. I want to just go through a few steps about succession planting. First, what is succession planting? In a nutshell, I guess the best way that I think about it, I know what I used to do. When this time of the year came, I started enough seeds that I literally had more transplants than I could plant in my entire garden space. Every square inch that I had would be taken up, and then I'd still have plants left over. And then what typically would happen is, first off, I could never get them all planted on time. There was just too many of them and not enough of me. And then to keep them maintained, whether that meant hoeing or mulching or whatever method I was using, could never get it all done. And then the worst part is that oftentimes the majority of them all came in at the same time. All of a sudden I went from having no flowers to having so many flowers. Was I able to harvest them all? Was I able to sell them all, particularly when you're just starting out and don't have a large customer base yet? And then I'm not even sure where I learned about succession planting from, but it was like such a light bulb moment for me. And then, so you go through all that, and then all of a sudden, 3-4 months from now, everything starts to kind of maybe peter a little bit, meaning it's just not as voluptuous or as abundant as it was at first, but you have no space left to plant anything in your garden. And I really suffered for several years, kind of struggling with that until I discovered, and I'm pretty sure I learned about this actually through a vegetable person of a book that I was reading to learn about maintaining a garden. And it was like a light bulb moment for me. So basically, instead of doing what I just described, you break your garden space up into 2 or 3 or 4 sections. It just depends on how much space you have and what it is you're doing. At the very minimum, I would recommend 3 sections, meaning, a third of your garden is this block, another third is this block, and the third is another block. And when I say a block is like a group of beds, maybe. If you have a super small garden, it might be one bed. You'd have 3 beds, one for each forecasted succession planting and group of plants this time of the year, the first warm season. Then in 4 to 8 weeks to 12 weeks after that, you would plant, oftentimes it's many of the same plants. Sometimes you would choose different colors because they're going to be blooming later in the season. You plant it again. You always have space in your garden, and if you have to really discipline yourself to stick with a schedule like this. What often happens is we again start more than we should, not necessarily more plants of the plan that we had. We add in a ton of extra stuff, and that happens to all of us. And there is surely nothing wrong with that, but you have to know that's going to cause havoc in your plan. You have to make adjustments. You have to really discipline yourself and make a commitment to try to do this, because I will promise you, once you go through a season with succession planting, you're not going to understand how you ever survived before you did it. So basically, succession planting means instead of planting your entire space at once, you break it up into sections and plant it out over time. And for me, I always tend to talk about succession planting by starting out in fall. So we fall plant a lot of flowers on our farm. We have for years cool flowers. And so that would be one block or section of my garden. Then the next block would be those very early spring plantings. Those are more cool flowers that are planted in very early spring. Then the third block, because I break up into more than 3 sections, is the first warm season planting. And then we would proceed for 2 or 3 more plantings. And once the flowers start blooming and you get into the ebb and flow of this, it is very overwhelming when you're thinking about it. That's why I really suggest you start very simply. And I will say this is very true for vegetables and even herbs. I learned from a vegetable person. This is how we provide consistent, long haul supply, y'all. I understand if you feel like one area is not going to give what you think you need, then you've got a bigger problem than that. You need to, how are you going to get more space, or you can do like I did and just decide that you're going to squeeze a lot more out of a small space than anybody ever told you you could. That's kind of how that worked out for me. So to get the consistent supply, you've got to continually plant through the season. You can't plant everything at once. We do it for flowers and vegetables. And I've got this little list of questions that I thought of. It's like, why do it? Why do it? Oh my goodness. How many? I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but you get into July and August, and all of a sudden, all that stuff, that first few years when I wasn't succession planting, you get into July and August, and the stuff that I planted back in April, that's been blooming now for 30 days plus, it's still producing for sure, but it's not producing the big, abundant first. You know how the first of a crop, those first couple of weeks you're cutting is just the best. That's what you start missing. Then you add in a lot of heat, sometimes drought, an exhausted farmer. It can quickly become kind of a not a very happy time for you. Versus if you have fresh new crops coming on, it really can change the way that your season, the way it's going for you, I guess. So what would you succession plant? So I succession plant pretty much most of the annuals that we grow, which is the lion's share of what we grow. I mean, if you're growing in a small space, annuals have proven to be the ticket for us. They produce the biggest bang in the smallest space for the longest period of time versus perennials, which are wonderful. I mean, I do grow peonies. There's a few select perennials that I grow, but the value I had to look at is how much do they produce even though they take up real estate year round, right? So there is definitely a place for that. And if you have space, perennials are a wonderful thing, but annuals are what we succession plant and can really kind of forecast and really get more bang for our buck. So annuals, any of the annuals that are branching, like many of the coxcombs, zinnias, ageratum, basils, gomphrena, all of those are annuals that branch. And we would do a big planting very early, not very early, but in spring, I guess we would say, which is what we're on the verge of doing now in a couple of weeks. Then we would plant them again in 6 to 8 weeks. And it was just so wonderful for our production to have the first crop still producing, but now there's a new fresh crop. And especially if you're selling to florists or commercially, maybe through a collective or something, you always have high demand for what we would call grade A flowers. Grade A flowers are the biggest blooms, and the longest stems. And sometimes when plants start to get tired, that's what starts to go. Maybe the stem length isn't what it used to be, or the flowers aren't as big. So all of a sudden, those grade B flowers, which are still wonderful flowers, they're perfect for mixed bouquets and farmers market sales and subscriptions, members only markets, all those things. But it was imperative to us to have more high quality flowers. And so some people say, well, my flowers just really produce all summer. Well, that's great. But here's the other reasons that you might want to consider succession planting. Y'all, stuff happens. For me personally, the two things that I have seen have major impact on us is a weather event or a pest or disease outbreak. So let's just say that you are a succession planter. For me, I was really fortunate that I had, during the high days, we had three big separate gardens. I mean, when I say separate, I'm only got 3 acres. So they're kind of in this close proximity, but not right up against each other. And the nature of where their location was, sometimes if a weather event would come that was really bad, I mean, stuff like the Thursday afternoon, 15-minute torrential rain with a 60-mile-an-hour blow that just flattens some areas. I mean, there is no netting that will hold flowers up in that kind of situation, right? We often found that when those types of things happen, it doesn't do, I mean, short of a hurricane, it doesn't flatten the whole garden. It's just areas. And how amazing is it to have the back garden, which didn't get touched, while the big garden that was up against the pasture really suffered damage. So weather events, it's really nice to have some of your summer stuff or whatever season we're talking about planted in one area and having another backup in another area. And so that really proved for me to be super beneficial. And then also pest and disease. Zinnias have always played a significant role in our cash crops. I mean, people love them, all customers, commercial and retail. And sometimes the weather conditions are such that, mildew is going to happen sooner or later. We hope later, and that we can control it just through harvesting habits and variety selection. And to have zinnias scattered throughout our farm really makes a big difference when diseases start. It really helps to cut it down. I mean, one of my practices when we're planting is to always have a bed of zinnias, perhaps, and a bed of something else, a bed of zinnias, a bed of something else. Always having different variety plants between the beds of zinnias. And that effort, succession planting, really helps to create a better scenario for that. And so I just got asked this on an Ask a Flower Farmer, a small grower who wants to do sunflower successions. I mean, the sunflower succession program that we started, I guess it's been over a decade ago now, really changed everything for us. And I really learned even more about how important succession planting was. By planting single stem, same variety sunflowers every single week means that you're going to have sunflowers every single week. And that means that you can market your flowers that way. People come to depend on you, and it gets easier to sell your flowers. So what she asked was, how does she succession plant? How does she do the planting part of that? How do you manage that? And I'll share with you what I shared with her, especially now that we're doing very much the same thing as she is. We're not planting full beds of sunflowers these days. Back when we were planting 1,200 every week, that was a whole bed of 100 foot long of just sunflowers. Well, now we're doing a much smaller volume. So the best way that I have found to manage this, if you want to try to implement sunflower succession planting for consistency, is I designate one full bed that would host probably several weeks of sunflower successions. I prepare the entire bed, meaning we add the dry organic fertilizer, we incorporate it, maybe we put a little compost or whatever, leaf mold, whatever we have on hand, and prepare the bed. And then I plant my first week at the head or at the foot of the bed. Then we cover the rest of the bed with a silage tarp. The silage tarp prevents weeds from sprouting and growing in that area of the bed that's not yet planted. I mean, that's the biggest problem, right? Is you want to hold that bed until you're ready to plant something. Then next week, we just fold the silage tarp back, the needed amount of footage, plant our sunflowers, and go to the next week and do the same thing. That is a really easy way to do it. I've never done that on any other flower other than sunflowers. I have found that succession planting the rest of the annuals tends to work best for harvesting habits and everything else, to plant in blocks of beds. I used big time plant 30 beds, 100-foot beds in each block. But as we have downsized, we now do 10 bed blocks, and they're shorter. So there's a lot of variation, but figuring it out will save you and make your life, it makes it easier to sell and market yourself, and you just have a better supply of flowers. It's just really proven to be super successful for us. We'll hear more after we take a quick break. Here at the Gardener's Workshop, the Field and Garden podcast is just one of the ways we are telling the stories of gardeners and farmers, sharing the ways that they grow flowers and businesses. We also have the Field and Garden blog, our video resource guide, plus our YouTube channel and our online garden shop that includes the same tools, seeds, and supplies you hear mentioned on this podcast. Other resources include our online schools and on-demand courses covering flower farming, gardening, and more, all available at thegardenersworkshop.com. Stay in the loop of all the happenings here at TGW by requesting our free weekly e-farm news. It is the front page to the happenings here at TGW. Sign up below or over at thegardenersworkshop.com. We just starting our zinnias, so I thought that's what we ought to talk about, given the 411 on how we do zinnias, and thought it would be a great topic for today. You know, one thing that I have learned is zinnias are the universal flower. Zinnias and sunflowers are universal. I mean, it doesn't matter. Commercial customers, retail customers, young, old, men, women, everybody is on board with them. So took me a lot of years to kind of figure out that it could really be that simple. So zinnias have proven, after 24 years of not only growing them as a commercial crop, as a flower farmer, but also as a retailer selling seeds, beyond a shadow of a doubt, zinnias are the top dog. Everybody loves them for a lot of different reasons, which we all, you know, if you're a zinnia lover, I don't need to review that with you, but I just didn't really embrace that when I first started growing. I mean, even for the first 5 or 6 years, I grew zinnias, but I never had enough. And it finally took, you know, week after week of, for instance, you know, I went through a period of time during my growing career where we grew a very large lily program, meaning I planted like 250 cut flower lilies a week for many, many weeks every year. And, you know, lilies are like tulips. You can just keep on getting more and more and more. And that's kind of where we were. We were growing a lot of them. We sold the heck out of them. And I was so proud of them. And then every week when we would have our members only market, our customers would come and I'd say, oh my gosh, come over and look at this XYZ lily, whatever lily, you know, we'd always get a couple of them open so customers could see them before they bought them in bud, which is the way you sell them. And I would say, isn't this the most gorgeous lily you have ever seen? They say, oh my gosh, it really is. I'll take 2 dozen zinnias. It took about 4 or 5 direct hits between my eyeballs for that to really sink in. And that was my beginning of my journey of realizing that I needed to really embrace growing what would sell every single week, week after week, year after year, that not only sells consistently, but was the easiest for me to grow, the lowest investment, um, just an all around good business decision, right? So that got me off of growing a lot of other stuff. Every year when I'm making our calendar plan, she'd say, we need more zinnias. Now, you keep in mind that, I mean, at some points in times, I was growing 40 or 50 100-foot beds of zinnias, and she was still expressing that we just never have enough zinnias. That's just no exaggeration. And it's not that everybody needs to grow that much. I'm just saying that yes, they're not easy to grow, but they are easy to grow. They are easy to grow, but they aren't easy to grow big, gorgeous, honking zinnias all the time. That's the part that most people kind of miss out on. But zinnias are easy to grow, and I'm just going to run through kind of the process of how I grow them, because I just want to for you to realize too that being highly successful in creating profit for your business happens when you grow crops that you don't have a lot of income invested in, as well as low risk, as in if you lost some for whatever reason, it's not a big dent in your bottom line. And the more I explored this, the more I came to appreciate learning how to grow big, beautiful, gorgeous zinnias and having them all the time for our customers. And so I'm just going to kind of run through how I do that. And then at the end, I'll just run through my favorites. So, first off, we, of course, like we do everything else, we start everything indoors. We start zinnias in the 3/4 inch small block. If you read the seed package, zinnias do say they want to be covered with soil because they germinate best in darkness. So that means that if you haven't seen a zinnia seed, it looks like a little arrowhead. It's got a real pointy end, and then the other end, we call it the tail. That's the part that breaks away from the flower. So we put the pointy end first, which just makes it easier, and push it down into the block, and the tail is going to be sticking out. And we follow all the normal steps for seed starting. We put them onto a seedling heat mat, and when 50% of them sprout, we then move them to the grow light and off the heat. We grow them in general for about 2 weeks under the grow light, or actually indoors a total of 2 weeks. So if it takes them 2 to 3 days to sprout, then they're probably spending about 12 days or so under a grow light, getting good size on them. Zinnias are quick growers. By the time from the moment we start the seed to when they get planted in the garden is usually about 3 weeks or so. And that all can depend on a lot. I mean, you can push the envelope a little bit either way to suit your weather needs, but that would be about 2 weeks of indoor growing, and then about 1 week sitting outside under a carport in our hardening off area, getting acclimated to wind, to sun, to heat, all of those things that plants just really need to get at in this warm season. Plants particularly need to get acclimated to before we put them outside. So we do water our, every Monday. My watering can has the Neptune's Harvest seaweed fish, so they get a dose of that every Monday, like everybody under grow lights or out on the carport gets every week. They're planted into beds. The beds that we plant them into is covered with the Bio 360, so we have no really weeding chores. And depending on the time of the year when we're planting them, it could be the black side up. But if heat is already becoming a factor, if it's going over 80 or 85 degrees in the afternoon already, then we make our beds with the gray side of the Bio 360 up. Those beds are prepared, and we apply the dry organic fertilizer according to the directions. It's a general purpose fertilizer, and you can find, I do not fertilize them anymore. They don't get anything else in the garden. My beds are 30 inches wide, and we typically do 4 rows of almost all annuals. Zinnias are the same, 4 rows across the bed, 6 inches apart in the row. And basically, we plant them. I mean, I just love summer annuals. You plant them, and within a week, you come back, you can't even see the top of the bed because the vegetation has grown so much, right? That's why you have such great weed control when you use the Bio 360. It's blocking the light to the rest of the bed while the plants are growing up. So we come back and net those beds. You will see on occasion zinnia beds on our farm that are not netted. Those are beds that just got away from us. Because I will tell you that when we do not net zinnias, our zinnias get 48 inches plus tall. All it takes is one 10-minute torrential downpour and the whole bed is a goner. Yeah, you can go along and cut the whole bed down to let it regrow, but that is a ton of work and you lose weeks of harvest. All if you had just netted the bed. I mean, that's what I stand at the end of the bed and just kick myself saying that. So, yes, we do net. And yes, you can harvest quickly and efficiently through netting. You just have to teach yourself how to do it or see how to do it and just get efficient at it. It's really quite simple after you're trained to do it. So, the stage of harvest that I prefer, zinnias do not develop any further once they're cut. When you cut them, that's the end of their development. If you cut them too soon, they're going to have a weak neck, and there's nothing you can really do short of sticking a wire in there to make them stiff. So it's really kind of a challenge for some people in the beginning to figure out what is the best harvest stage. My personal preference and what we found our customers really love is I learned the earliest that I could cut a zinnia that's big enough and voluptuous enough that would have a stiff neck. Meaning, I prefer to cut my zinnias before that. They call it the disc floret. That's the little yellow flowers that are in the center of zinnias. They're all right, but I like to cut mine before those open and before they're obvious. That's the part that makes the pollen. And not only does it create a whole different look to your zinnias by not having that yellow center, and I mean, we always have a mix. We don't always get to all of them before they do that. But my goal was always to have as many zinnias that were developed enough to have a strong neck, but before those disc florets were actually open because they are voluptuous. They are gorgeous at that stage. And we'll talk when I list my favorites. Some of them are even more gorgeous than other colors. Some of them are better at doing that. So in our harvest buckets, when we cut, all of our harvest buckets always have the CVBN tablets. Those are chlorine type tablets that go in the water. That kills all the bacteria that develops from the deposits that come from the end of stems when they hit the water, like this organic explosion happens. And instantly yucky stuff starts to grow. If you've ever seen a vase of zinnias in a clear vase and the water's cloudy, that's all bacteria that is just in there having a throwdown party going on. Using the CVB tablets in the harvest stage prevents that process from starting, or it doesn't prevent it, it prolongs it from happening, and it fills the stem with bacteria-free water. So basically, it buys you a couple of days of more of vase life. And then once we get our zinnias to the end user, whether it's a farmer's market customer, that customer would go home with a packet of flower food, which continues that biocide fight to keep the water clean. If you're a flower farmer and you're delivering, let's just say, buckets of zinnias to commercial growers, we would then use the holding tea bags because that too has biocide in it. Once you start the process with the CVBN tablets, it just really sets your flowers up to be to last longer. And these additional conditioning products at different stages just make that last longer. And as a flower farmer, it just makes your flowers last longer. And you have to harvest them today. Maybe you deliver them tomorrow. Maybe your florist uses them in 2 or 3 days. It makes a really big difference. So we have never put zinnias in the cooler. I know that they'll take a warmish cooler, meaning above 45 degrees, but we never had a need to do that. They do just fine in an air conditioned room for as little time as we actually sat on them. So just kind of a quick rundown on the favorite varieties. So beyond a shadow of a doubt, Benary's Giants are the most commercially grown because they're the most mildew resistant, the biggest, most voluptuous, most double and productive zinnia there is. Many years ago, probably now 15 years ago, I did a zinnia test. We bought every zinnia seed that we found on the market. We bought from retailers, we bought from wholesalers, seeds, and started. We had a whole field of 20 or 30 different varieties of zinnias, and it quickly became apparent to us why people go head over heels over our zinnias. Hands down, there was no other zinnia that had the growth habit and the reproduction and the size and the doubleness of Benary's Giants. So as a flower farmer, we always grew them by color. I mean, your florists want to order all the same color of a specific one, right? They don't want to buy mixed bunches. And so perhaps what has grown to become our favorites, the giant pink is one of the most prolific, biggest zinnias we have ever grown, but it's pink. So it's not a good color in the fall, but it is awesome in spring and summer. And I will tell you that some of the latest, you have to have been growing flowers for a long time to even remember this. The wine and the deep red were two colors that just came on the scene in the last 10 years. Both of them are really dark. They're really gorgeous, but we really don't grow them very often, except maybe in the fall. They just make bouquets dark. They have the stiffest stems, but they are just really, really dark. We always went with the poppin' bright colors, the lilac, the purple, the giant orange and the giant pink together. Oh my goodness, that is such a gorgeous color. And of course, the coral glows in the dark. The yellow is awesome, but I'll tell you my very favorite color of all the Benary's Giants is carmine rose. Think they just call it carmine now. I described it to florists, it was the color of watermelon, and they were always big and their stems were incredibly stiff. I definitely love the whites, but what you have to know about the white and the Benary's lime green is that their vase life just usually is just not as long as the other flowers, and it's because of their color. That light color just really, really reveals any blemishing. And of course, salmon goes, it's unsaid that that is just always one of the most popular colors year round, spring, summer, and fall. So we do grow other varieties of zinnias, but they are minor compared to our Benary's Giant stock hold. And the only other one that comes close to Benary's Giants is the hybrid called Uproar. Uproar Rose, which costs 20 times more than Benary's Giants, but I will tell you, it's a color that is not in Benary's Giants, and it glows in the dark. It is a magenta color, and we always grew a huge bed of them. And it is absolutely gorgeous. Now, I love the queens as much as the next person does, but you have to understand that they're a third of the size. The colors are great, so we always grew them. But like, for instance, we would grow one whole bed of all of these minor zinnias. Minor zinnias for me were the Queen series, Oklahoma series, and occasionally I would grow cactus. The problem with cactus zinnias is customers think they look like old flowers. It's the frilliness of that bloom. Not everybody thinks it looks great. So the lion's share was always the Benares giants, and perhaps the secret to producing killer zinnias all season long is succession planting them, friends. We planted them every 4 to 5 weeks all season long up until about 90 days before our last frost. That way, we always had enough abundance, but we always had new crops coming in, which you always know the first 2 or 3 weeks of cutting is the best flowers. The rest of the cutting time of those beds, they're great in bouquets and stuff, but those big honkers that you just want to have for your commercial customers or to be the focal of bouquets doesn't come after 6 weeks of cutting on a crop. The reason we discontinue fertilizing in the garden is that zinnias will grow pretty lean, meaning they don't need a lot of nutrition, particularly if you have good, healthy, organic, rich soil. But fertilizer not only feeds plants, it feeds mildew. The sugars in it just really pushes that. So we learned years ago from an extension agent that if I stopped feeding in the garden, that would, if it's, because mildew is always present. And the key is to keep it at bay for as long as you can. No, we do not treat it. I don't know if y'all caught my interview with Joe, the gardener, on his podcast. That's Joe of Grow a Greener World, the PBS show. He asked what we do for mildew, and I'll tell you what I told him. I said, we have a treatment. We mow them down. That's why you have successions, friends. So you can do that. Once mildew takes off, there's really nothing to be done except eliminate it.
Okay, welcome back. I hope you found these Clubhouse clips interesting and useful. I'm including links in the show notes to some of the things that Lisa mentioned in these chats. We'd also love to have you join us live on Clubhouse if you can. We're on at 1 p.m. Eastern on Wednesdays. I'll also include a link to Lisa's club on Clubhouse in the show notes. If you like what you're hearing here on the Field and Garden podcast, we'd love it if you'd tell a friend about us and leave a review for us wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Jessie from the Gardener's Workshop, and I hope you have a great day.